The Buffalo Bills have been around for 60 years, and it's hard to imagine them anywhere else. When you think of the city of Buffalo, odds are the Bills are the first thing that come to mind. But the thing with the Bills is that the idea of staying in Buffalo wasn't always the case. There was a question of whether they were going to stay in Buffalo after longtime owner and founder Ralph Wilson passed away. And over 40 years before that, in 1971, that same question popped up when Wilson seriously explored moving the Bills out of Buffalo and moving them to Seattle. That's right. There was a point in the 1970s where it was not just possible, but even somewhat probable that the Buffalo Bills would move across the country and to Seattle. And this is the story of how this almost came to be.
Baseball is played on a diamond, in a park, the baseball park.
Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, sometimes called Soldier Field or War Memorial Stadium.
As is the case with seemingly 99% of relocation rumors, they stem from the desire to get a new stadium. And Buffalo is no exception. Our story begins in 1937, when War Memorial Stadium opened up. It was a stadium built in the 1930s, and over the years, nothing whatsoever was done to get the stadium to not look like a relic of the 1930s. In fact, the 1984 baseball film The Natural was filmed at War Memorial Stadium specifically because it looked like a rundown stadium from the 30s. In the first 20 years of the stadium's existence, it hosted a few professional sports teams, most notably the Buffalo Bills of the All-American Football Conference in the late 1940s. But in the 1960s, Ralph Wilson brought pro football back to Buffalo when the Bills became members of the American Football League, and they would play their games at War Memorial Stadium, given the nickname of the Rock Pile. And very quickly, it was clear that the Rock Pile was arguably the worst stadium in professional football. Now, sometimes when a team complains about a stadium not being up to par, it's simply because it's not as state-of-the-art as other stadiums are. But on its own, it's a perfectly fine stadium. War Memorial Stadium was not one of those instances. It just flat out stunk by any measurement. The locker room showers didn't always work. It was in a rough neighborhood. The neighborhood was so rough, in fact, that during a 1969 baseball game involving the Buffalo Bisons, the ball boy was held at knife point by a gang. The field froze. Players would routinely fall over the pitcher's mound since the stadium was primarily designed for baseball. And in 1968, Ralph Wilson said that all owners who bring their clubs into Buffalo are appalled by the stadium. At one point, things got so bad that the Bills had trouble scheduling preseason games at home because nobody wanted to go there. It also didn't help that after the merger, the stadium was deemed way too small by NFL standards. As part of the merger agreement, Commissioner Pete Rozelle pretty much mandated that teams play in stadiums that hold at least 50,000 spectators. The inability to find a stadium like this was part of the reason why the Patriots were considering moving out of Boston, and why the Vikings considered moving to Birmingham, which I made a video on if you want to check that out. At the time, War Memorial Stadium could only hold 46,500 fans, and this was after an expansion occurred in the mid-60s. The stadium was locked in, with no more room to grow. At this point, it was abundantly clear that the Bills and the city of Buffalo needed a brand new stadium. And if Ralph Wilson didn't get one, he was going to pack his bags and he was going to move the team to Seattle. Now, keep in mind that throughout this time, there was no dispute between Ralph Wilson and the city of Buffalo about the need for a new stadium. For years and years, the Erie County legislature was debating on the logistics of a brand new stadium, and these talks only heightened after the Buffalo Bisons moved to Winnipeg due to the lack of attendance and the poor conditions of the stadium. And again, seeing as the stadium's neighborhood and security were so bad that a ball boy was held at knife point by a gang, I can't exactly blame them for leaving town. All the way back in 1968, the Erie County Legislature authorized a bond of $50 million for a stadium project. That's roughly $370 million today. The only problem with this was that things were absolutely catastrophic behind the scenes in determining what type of stadium to build. Now, Ralph Wilson didn't exactly care whether the stadium was domed or not. He wanted an open-air stadium, and he didn't feel like a dome was a necessity, but he said that if the city met him halfway and built him a dome stadium, he would not object. But this wasn't the sentiment elsewhere. You had the pro-dome crowd, who wanted Buffalo to have a facility that rivaled the Houston Astrodome. It would allow the city to use the venue year-round and would increase attendance in later months of the season when the temperature dropped considerably. Looking at Buffalo's attendance over the previous few seasons as it got into December, you could definitely see a decline when the weather outside became a little bit frightful. The Construction Trade Council of Buffalo came out and said that it wouldn't even help out with building the stadium if it wasn't a dome. And then there was the anti-dome crowd. There was a major hurdle to building a domed venue in Buffalo, which unsurprisingly had to do with the cost of such a venture. The bond was for $50 million, and the construction bids for the dome were listed at $72 million. The 20-member body of the legislature voting on the stadium was anti-dome for this reason, and by a vote of 11-9, they struck down this proposal, though they voted 19-1 immediately after to seek an alternative project, knowing just how dire the situation was. At this point, the fighting between the pro-dome and the anti-dome crowd was incredibly frustrating for Ralph Wilson. There had been years and years of gridlock where nothing was going on. Again, he wanted the 80,000-seat open-air stadium, but he didn't care if it was a 65,000-seat dome. He just wanted a stadium at this point, and was growing increasingly frustrated with the city's activity. So on January 14th, 1971, Wilson issued a threat to the city. Get me a new stadium by the time the owners' meetings are held on March 22nd, or I'm moving the team. Ralph Wilson looked at 3 cities for this relocation. Tampa and Memphis expressed interest, but the number one target for Wilson was to move his team to Seattle. The Seattle Bills. It made sense as to why Wilson wanted to move the team there if he couldn't get his stadium in Buffalo. For one, Seattle was one of the largest cities in the country. According to the 1970 US Census, it had a population that was larger than a bunch of other cities in the NFL at the time, including Buffalo. There was also little competition in the pro sports market. Seattle only had one pro sports team, and that was the Seattle Supersonics of the NBA. During the 1970-71 season, not only were the Sonics above the league average in attendance, but they were right near the top of the league. If you look at both the NBA and the ABA, there weren't too many pro basketball teams that drew more fans than the Sonics did per game. Rest in peace. On top of that, this untapped market in Seattle had a stadium that was ready to go. Husky Stadium, home of the University of Washington, had 58,000 spectators, which was right in line with Roselle's stadium capacity requirements of the merger. And the stadium was due to be expanded to somewhere between 65,000 and 70,000 seats if the Bills wound up moving. There was definite interest on both sides, and though Wilson would have needed 2/3 of the owners to agree on the move, considering the fact that the owners hated playing in Buffalo, and the fact that Seattle wasn't anywhere near the territory of infringing of any other existing NFL teams, there is absolutely nothing to suggest that Wilson wouldn't have gotten his way with the move. However, Wilson first and foremost wanted to stay in Buffalo. He just wanted a stadium. And sure enough, after 4 years of debate and inactivity, he finally got his way. Later in 1971, the city agreed to fund an open-air stadium. The stadium opened in 1973, and to this day, Rich Stadium, now known as New Era Field, has been the home to the Bills ever since. 3 years after the stadium opened up, Seattle got their team, as the Seahawks began play in 1976. So in the end, I guess you can say that everything worked out quite nicely for both Buffalo and Seattle. What the future holds for the Bills on the field remains to be seen. But off the field, it doesn't seem like they're leaving Buffalo anytime soon. And at the very least, they're not leaving to play in Seattle.